On a cool spring day in
think I will get
2019,
my own yacht.
in the city of Hamburg, the stage lights illuminated a young woman as she stepped out before one of the largest digital marketing conventions in the world. She was only 25 years old, confident, poised, and carrying the weight of a fortune built not by her
I find
hands,
the
but
accusations
by her
amusing,
family's
really.
empire of sweet confections. Her name was Verena Bahlsen. The Bahlsen Company is a name that resonates in millions of households. From the famous Leibniz butter biscuits, to the chocolate-covered Choco Leibniz, to the little bags of animal crackers that generations of children have nibbled on, this German family-run brand has thrived for decades, producing hundreds of millions in yearly revenue. To most, it was simply a cookie company. But to Verena, it was also a crown. And on that stage, she wore it boldly. With cameras rolling, she declared that she was proud to be a young millionaire.
Good morning, everyone.
And even joked that what she really wanted next was her own yacht. The audience gasped. What might have been a careless attempt at lighthearted humor instead felt tone-deaf, even arrogant. Because behind the sweetness of Bahlsen's biscuits was a dark, bitter
Verena, can
history
you tell us your
that
side
no
of the
yacht,
story?
no wealth could ever wash away. During the years of the Second World
This
War,
case
from
reveals the hidden complexities of the
1940
past.
until its bloody end, Bahlsen employed hundreds of forced laborers in their Hanover factory. And while the company had long tried to bury that truth, Verena's words reopened the wound. When confronted, she doubled down. Speaking to a German tabloid, she dismissed the criticism, insisting the forced laborers had been, before her time, that they were paid the same as German workers, and that they had been treated well. It was a disastrous response. To many, it sounded like the rewriting of history, a convenient excuse to protect an image. Within days, Verena was forced into the shadows, pressured to issue a public apology. But by then, the storm had already broken, and investigative journalists were digging deeper. What they unearthed was far worse. They discovered that the Bahlsen family had not only used forced labor, but that its members had joined the Nazi Party, had donated money to the SS, and had taken over a factory in Kiev after the Nazi occupation, using laborers brought from there to Germany. The sweet empire of Bahlsen was not built on sugar and flour alone, it was also built on suffering. And so, the family hired historian Manfred Krieger to examine their past. But let's be honest, they did this not out of conscience, but out of convenience. Only once the
We are
world was
still
watching did
reviewing
they
the
open the
evidence.
doors to that hidden history. Verena Bahlsen is not a Nazi. That much is clear. But her family's legacy is tangled in one of history's darkest chapters. And while Bahlsen is far from the worst, it is not unique. Because in Germany, behind the polished glass towers and luxury brands of today's economy, lie dynasties of unimaginable wealth. Dynasties that once shook hands with Hitler's regime, profited from war, and then buried the truth as they built empires that still thrive today. The question is, how many of these families have truly faced their past, and how many are still trying to hide it? Today, Germany is hailed as the economic powerhouse of the European Union. It's a nation that survived devastation, rebuilt itself, and now holds a commanding grip on global manufacturing. From luxury cars to industrial machinery, from insurance giants to consumer brands, German business is a model of discipline and strength. But beneath this polished surface lies a truth that makes Germany's corporate landscape very different from that of other Western nations. Unlike the United States or Britain, where public corporations and shareholder-driven enterprises dominate, Germany's strongest and most influential companies are often controlled not by anonymous boards, but by families. Families whose names you rarely hear, but whose fingerprints are on products you use every day. Families whose fortunes stretch across generations. And, as with all families, they carry histories that don't always fit neatly into glossy brochures or company websites. Journalist David de Jong, Middle East correspondent for the Dutch Financial Daily, spent years unearthing these histories. His book, Nazi Billionaires, tells the story of 5 of Germany's wealthiest dynasties. It exposes how they profiteered under the Third Reich, how they collaborated with Hitler's regime, how they escaped justice after 1945, and how their heirs today wrestle or refuse to wrestle with that poisoned inheritance. What de Jong found is staggering. While some families have taken steps to acknowledge their crimes, others have twisted, evaded, and whitewashed. They've only admitted what they had to, and often only when public pressure left them no choice. And yet, these families are not relics of history. They remain among the richest, most powerful people in the world. They top financial leaderboards, but their names and faces remain hidden to most. To understand this hidden legacy, we must look not only at the corporations, but at the men and women who built them. Men who were not just businessmen, but ideologues. Men who sat in the inner circle of the Nazi Party. Men who funded experiments, armed militias, and exploited slave labor to fuel both the war machine and their own empires. And in this story, we will not only confront the crimes of those industrialists, but also the silence of their heirs, the way wealth built on atrocity has been passed down, generation after generation, polished until it gleams like stainless steel, but never truly cleansed. It begins with the face of one of the darkest architects of the Nazi regime, a man who made genocide an industrial system and the business elites who stood at his side. To understand how Germany's business dynasties became entangled with the Nazi regime, we must begin with one of the most chilling figures in modern history, Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was no ordinary Nazi official. He was one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, the man Hitler entrusted with implementing the final solution. As head of the SS, Himmler created the blueprint for mass extermination. He organized concentration camps, oversaw deportations, and dictated who was considered German and who was marked for destruction. His machinery of death consumed millions of lives. But Himmler did not work alone. Behind him stood a circle of powerful industrialists, businessmen who saw opportunity in war, profit in persecution, and influence in aligning themselves with Hitler's most feared lieutenant. Together, they created a private fund of nearly 1 million Reichsmarks, money Himmler could use outside of state budgets. This fund supported projects like Aryan eugenics research, which sought to purify the German bloodline by tearing children from their parents, categorizing them by race, and assigning them to new families, while those deemed unworthy were sent to camps where death awaited. Among these businessmen, one man stood out, Richard Kozlowski, the CEO of the Oetker company, a name that millions of families worldwide still recognize today. Kozlowski was not just a financier. He was a true believer, a Nazi ideologue. In his office hung a portrait of Hitler. To new employees, he handed out signed copies of Mein Kampf. He was deeply embedded in Himmler's inner circle, attending meetings at Berlin's Aero Club, where ideology and industry intertwined. And Kozlowski's devotion wasn't merely symbolic. He funneled money directly into Himmler's Lebensborn project, the program that kidnapped children, rebranded them as Aryan, and erased their pasts. This was not business as usual. This was active participation in the machinery of racial terror. Yet Kozlowski was not only shaping his company's present, he was also shaping the future of its heirs. He became the stepfather to a boy who would inherit the empire and carry the Oetker name to global recognition, Rudolf August Oetker. For Rudolf, Kozlowski was not just a guardian. He was a mentor, a role model. Decades later, Rudolf would speak of him with admiration, calling him a better father than my real one, and the best teacher I could have had. The lessons he absorbed would define both his own choices and the legacy of the Oetker dynasty. Because unlike his stepfather, Rudolf August Oetker did not merely sit behind a desk funding the regime. He volunteered for one of its most infamous branches. Unlike many young Germans who were drafted into service during the Second World War, Rudolf August Oetker made a choice. He volunteered. And not for just any military branch, he chose the Waffen-SS, the elite and fiercely ideological unit under Heinrich Himmler's command. The Waffen-SS was not a place for ordinary recruits. It was the stronghold of the most committed Nazis, a place where loyalty to Hitler's vision was demanded without compromise. Training was brutal, selective, and uncompromising. To volunteer for the SS was to declare not just allegiance, but devotion to the Nazi cause. Later in life, Rudolf would claim ignorance. He insisted he had never known about the full scale of concentration camps. But that defense crumbles under scrutiny. His training camp was part of a concentration camp complex, Prisoners thin, exhausted, terrified were forced to clean the barracks for him and his fellow recruits. To suggest he had no knowledge of what was happening around him is not only implausible, but insulting to the memory of those who suffered. And yet, when the war ended, Rudolf August Oetker did not face justice. Yes, he was detained for his role in the Waffen-SS, but he was quickly cleared in a denazification process that was, quite frankly, riddled with bias. An internal committee made up entirely of his own company's employees exonerated him. A few months later, British officials confirmed the decision. The truth was buried beneath lies. He told investigators he had been forced into the SS, when in reality he had volunteered. He claimed ignorance, when in fact he had been surrounded by evidence of human suffering. But these contradictions didn't stop him. Instead, they paved the way for him to rise even higher. Because while Germany was rebuilding from ruins, Rudolf August Oetker stepped into the role of CEO. Under his leadership, the company flourished. Over the following decades, Dr. Oetker transformed into a global empire, frozen pizzas, baking goods, desserts, and international giant generating billions in revenue. When Rudolf died in 2007, his legacy was not prison bars or shame. It was wealth. His empire was divided among his 8 children, each becoming a billionaire in their own right. They inherited not only a fortune, but also a name that, for decades, Rudolf had carefully polished to hide the stains of history. Only after his death in 2007 did the family commission historians to examine their Nazi past. The eldest children pushed for transparency, while the younger heirs resisted, clinging to denial. Even today, the Oetker family remains divided. Some want to acknowledge the truth. Others prefer silence. Visit the company's English website, and you'll find plenty about cakes and frozen pizza. You'll see how Rudolf rebuilt and diversified the company. But you won't read a single line about how he voluntarily joined the Waffen-SS, or how the company exploited forced labor. The shadows remain, carefully edited out for the global consumer. The Oetker children are among the wealthiest people alive today. But the question that lingers is not about their fortune, it's about their conscience. And the Oetkers, as troubling as their history may be, are not the only dynasty built on such foundations. There are families who put in even less effort, families who have done nothing at all to face the darkness in their past. In May 2017, 3 men sat together at a quiet restaurant outside Munich. One was a publisher, another a journalist, and the third was a man named Ernst Knut Stahl. Over dinner, Stahl spoke words that dripped with the same poison Germany had once tried to purge. He warned of danger ahead, pointed to a street in New York filled with bankers and lawyers. Coincidentally, all Jews, he remarked, and then muttered darkly about their supposed control. He added that Germany needed a newspaper that would tell the truth, and boasted that a former editor of Bild, one of Germany's most influential tabloids, was ready to help. Months later, such a paper emerged, openly sympathetic to the far-right AfD party. But the more pressing question was, where did the money come from? The answer led back to Stahl's employer, August von Fink Jr., one of Germany's quiet billionaires. Von Fink Jr. lived in Switzerland, far from the city he owned piece by piece. Through vast real estate holdings, he controlled more than half of Munich's city center and much of the surrounding land, some of the most valuable property on earth. By the time of his death in 2021, his fortune was estimated at over 8 billion euros. But his wealth, like so many others in this story, had roots entwined with the Third Reich. To understand that fortune, we need to go back to August von Fink Sr., the man who built the dynasty's power. In 1931, in Berlin's luxurious Hotel Kaiserhof, Adolf Hitler gathered some of Germany's wealthiest men to ask for money to arm the SA, the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing. The first man he approached was August von Fink Sr., a powerful banker with major stakes in Allianz and Munich Re, 2 insurance giants co-founded by his family. Von Fink Sr. agreed without hesitation. He helped channel millions of Reichsmarks to fund Hitler's paramilitaries, ensuring himself a place among the regime's most favored financiers. And when the persecution of Jews intensified, von Fink Sr. saw opportunity. He targeted Jewish-owned banks, writing letters to officials urging their expropriation on racial grounds. When Jewish competitors were forced out, he swooped in. During the terror of Kristallnacht, he gained control of banks for a fraction of their value. He pressured Jewish banker Willy Dreyfus to sell his institution far below its worth. He bought the Rothschild Bank in Vienna, while its owner sat imprisoned by the SS. This was not just opportunity, it was complicity. Allies later described von Fink Sr. as a convinced Nazi, a man who believed Hitler was sent by God to save Germany. He would have died for his beliefs, they said. But he didn't have to, because after 1945, he walked away. At his denazification trial, evidence mysteriously vanished. Witnesses disappeared. Prosecutors watered down charges. Rumors circulated that von Fink Sr. had blackmailed officials with knowledge of their private lives, including homosexual relationships in a deeply intolerant era. In the end, he escaped with nothing more than a token financial payment, less than 2,000 marks, which he successfully appealed on the grounds of an old war injury. By 1970, he was the second richest man in Germany, and when he died, his son inherited the fortune. August von Fink Jr. quietly expanded the empire, selling off major banking shares and consolidating power in Munich real estate. When he passed in 2021, his heirs became billionaires many times over. But here is the silence. Search their foundations, their companies, their official statements, and you will find little to nothing acknowledging the origin of this wealth. No reckoning, no apology, no memorial, just silence, while the money continues to flow. And still, the von Finks were not alone. There was another family, richer still, whose products we all know, whose cars drive the roads of every continent, and whose legacy is tied not only to Nazi financing, but to the very heart of Hitler's propaganda machine. In September 2015, one of the richest women in the world, Suzanne Klatten, stood before reporters. As heiress to the BMW empire, she spoke about Germany's great industrial founders. But if you listen carefully, you notice something strange. She never once mentioned her grandfather, the man who laid the foundation for her family's fortune. His name was Günther Quandt, and his story is one of the darkest chapters in German industry. Back in February 1933, just weeks after Hitler seized power, a handful of Germany's wealthiest industrialists gathered at the home of Hermann Göring. Among them was Günther Quandt. They were told, bluntly, that Hitler's goal was nothing less than the end of democracy. And when the collection plate came around, Quandt wrote a check. His money, like that of Krupp, Flick, and others, helped solidify the Nazi rise. But unlike Krupp, Quandt never faced justice after the war, yet his crimes were staggering. He became one of the Reich's leading suppliers of weapons and batteries. He expanded his empire by seizing Jewish-owned businesses, exploiting conquered territories, and most chilling of all, by using tens of thousands of forced laborers. At one factory in Hanau, he built a sub-camp of a concentration camp in collaboration with the SS. Prisoners worked in hellish conditions, flesh and bone torn by machinery, accidents with boiling metal, random executions. The company even calculated that an average slave laborer would survive only 6 months. This was industrialized cruelty, designed for profit. And yet, when the war was over, none of this was discussed at Quandt's denazification trial. He was labeled merely a fellow traveler, fined a small sum, and allowed to return to his empire. The Quandt name is also tied to one of the most infamous figures of the regime, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister. After divorcing his second wife Magda, Günther Quandt watched as she married Goebbels. Together they raised Günther's own son, Harald Quandt. As Goebbels' beloved stepson, the connection could not have been closer. Harald grew up in the heart of Nazi power. Magda and Goebbels' 6 children would later be poisoned in Hitler's bunker as the Reich collapsed, but Harald survived, spared only because he was away as a soldier. After the war, he inherited millions, and his descendants today control billions through a family office. But it is not Harald who saved the Quandt fortune. That role belonged to Herbert Quandt, Günther's eldest son. After the war, Herbert rebuilt the family standing and, in the 1,960 seconds, famously saved BMW from bankruptcy. Today, the family controls nearly half of BMW. with Suzanne Clatton and her brother Stefan Quandt among the richest people alive. Here's the bitter irony. Herbert Quandt is still celebrated as a visionary, a savior of German industry. There is even a media prize and a foundation in his name. Yet historical evidence shows he, too, exploited forced labor, even female prisoners, in occupied Poland. According to prosecutors who worked on Nuremberg trials, if the full truth had come out, Herbert Quandt would have been indicted as a war criminal. And still, his heirs resist full transparency. In 2007, a German documentary exposed the Quandt family's Nazi past. Only then did they commission historians to investigate. When pressed, they updated Herbert's biography, but only slightly, adding just enough detail to appear honest, while continuing to praise him as visionary and daring. Today, the Quandts maintain BMW, their foundations, and their billions. They support museums and Jewish organizations, and they make gestures toward reconciliation. But the shadows remain. Their name is written into history not just as industrialists, but as profiteers of dictatorship, slavery, and propaganda. The German state teaches remembrance. School children are taken to memorials and museums to ensure the Holocaust is never forgotten. Yet among the nation's richest dynasties, remembrance is often carefully curated and sometimes avoided altogether. Because while Germany as a nation has embraced a culture of guilt and memory, some of its most powerful families still live in wealth built on silence. After the fall of the Third Reich, Germany was a nation in ruins not only physically, but morally. Cities lay in rubble, millions were dead, and the world demanded accountability. For decades, the German people wrestled with guilt, shame, and the crushing weight of their country's crimes. A culture of remembrance slowly took shape. The government financed memorials, museums, and archives. School children were taken on tours of concentration camps, forced to walk the grounds where unspeakable horrors unfolded. The goal was clear: never again. Never allow such radicalization, such violence, to rise unchecked. Never forget the fragility of democracy when poisoned by hate. And yet, within this national reckoning, silence lingered in the wealthiest corners. While ordinary Germans were taught to confront the past, the dynasties who had profited from Hitler's rule were often allowed to evade justice. They reinvented themselves, rebuilt their companies, and passed down fortunes soaked in history's darkest stain. The Bahlsens polished their cookie empire, insisting forced laborers had been treated well. The Oetkers split between heirs who wanted transparency and those who clung to denial. The von Finks amassed vast real estate, never acknowledging how expropriated Jewish banks laid the foundation of their fortune. And the Quandts through BMW became symbols of German success, while avoiding a full reckoning with their use of slave labor and ties to Goebbels himself. What unites these families is not only their wealth, but their ability to shape memory. Their official websites speak of innovation, vision, leadership. Their foundations promote responsible values. But the words Nazi, slave labor, complicity, these are buried, softened, or erased. Transparency only arrives when the pressure becomes unbearable. When journalists uncover the truth, when documentaries force the conversation, only then do these dynasties reluctantly admit to fragments of their history. And even then, the language is careful, controlled, never quite enough to tarnish the brand, never enough to make the past truly inescapable. It leaves us with a haunting question. Can a fortune built on atrocity ever be cleansed? Can money inherited from war crimes ever be considered neutral, when the families who hold it still benefit from that poisoned soil? Germany has taught the world the importance of memory. Its culture of remembrance stands as a model, a warning, and a duty. But remembrance must go beyond state museums and school trips. It must live in the boardrooms of BMW, in the foundations of Oetker, in the real estate of Munich, in every cookie, every car, every company whose roots stretch back into the Reich. Because history is not just what we read in books, it is what we consume, what we drive, what we invest in. It is baked into our everyday lives, sweet, glossy, convenient, until someone dares to peel back the wrapper and see what lies beneath. And when we do, we find that the greatest empires of today are not only built on ambition and vision, they are also built on silence.